Hello, hello, hello. This is Gresh from the I Am CEO podcast, and I have a very special guest on the show today, at Projjal Ghatak. Projjal, excited to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me, Gresh. It's good to be here.
Yes, excited to have you on and talk about all the awesome things that you're doing. And of course, before we do that, I want to read a little bit more about JJ Projjal so you can hear about those awesome things. And prior to founding OnLoop, Projjal spent 3.5 years at Uber in a variety of roles, including leading strategy and operations for business development globally, leading strategy and planning for the APAC rides business, and the GM of the Philippines ride business. Besides Uber, he has also spent time raising debt and equity from New York hedge funds for an industrial conglomerate, and strategy consulting in Southeast Asia from Accenture, and in early stage companies in Latin America, Blue Kite and L Market prior to that. Somewhere along the way, he spent 2 years at Stanford getting an MBA. And one of the things that I absolutely love about what Projjal and JJ is doing is that so many times we think that we have to choose either or, and everything that he's building, you don't have to choose either or. You can have both and be able to convert and have technology and also marry that with the human aspect and bring those two things together is a really phenomenal space. But one of the things I really loved about Projjal when I was reading a little bit more about this and preparing for this interview, he said his lifelong mission is to unlock out of each worker's full potential, and he feels privileged to work on that every single day. So, Projjal, excited to have you on the show. Are you ready to speak to the IMCO community?
Sorry, say it once more.
Are you ready to speak to the IMCO community?
Yes, absolutely.
Perfect. Well, let's get it started then. So to kind of kick everything off, what I wanted to do was rewind the clock a little bit, hear a little bit more on how you got started, what I call your CEO story.
Sure. So, I started OnLoop, which is the first company I've ever founded in 2020, a few months after I had left Uber. And I think one of the most constant threads of my entire career is a fundamental belief that businesses are about people, and the way you make businesses great are to bring the best out of your people. However, in my entire career, I also was woefully frustrated with the tools and approaches and processes that managers had to go through in order to bring out the best in those people. And in many ways, it felt like compliance processes, so things like performance management or sort of check boxes around learning and development that didn't really look at things from the lens of a manager. It looked at things from a lens of a functional user, and that might be HR or a different function. While on the other hand, we had seen, task management really accelerate in its sophistication through tools like Jira or Notion or Trello or Asana, and then more recently products like Zoom and Slack that made getting work done a whole lot better. And that's because, about 10 or 15 years ago, there was a decoupling of IT and engineering. So engineering, design, product, all of these functions were no longer seen as IT. They were seen as deeply strategic functions that innovated, versus IT was sort of what kept the machines running. And that decoupling led to people building products for the end user. And we just haven't quite seen that decoupling happen the same way when it comes to talent. And we sort of club HR or operations or strategic org work and behavioral psychology all in the same thing, and means that we don't get the requisite attention around it. And so for me, I really wanted to build a company and am building a company that's incredibly focused on driving talent outcomes, but from the lens of a manager or a leader that runs that organization. And very much focused on how do people give you ROI, and how do you make sure you get the most out of what is your biggest asset, and for many businesses, your biggest cost line item, and that's your people.
Nice. I absolutely love that. And I love how, you kind of have that realization, or you came to that realization, or explain how you came to it. But it makes so much sense where that word decoupling is so powerful, because I think that, we heard this, especially during the pandemic, of like, trying to solve today's problems with yesterday's solutions. And I think that we have all these new tools, as you mentioned, that are out there now. And
Yeah.
also, I think we have a little bit more of a, I guess, sophistication of understanding of like what people are looking for, what organizations are trying to achieve. So we need new solutions, or at least a new way to approach those things. It sounds like, to be able to solve those solutions of today, but also of tomorrow and the year after that, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I think there's been two seismic shifts for the workplace in the last 3 years. Obviously, one is a fairly permanent shift to hybrid and remote. And there are many different flavors of it around the world. I think people are still grappling with it in terms of what is optimal around it. And then two, the introduction of generative AI into the mainstream in terms of what it can really do for productivity. And if you think about a lot of a manager's job, a lot of that revolves around things like goals and feedback. And a lot of that is around language and having the right approach and vocabulary around it, for which Gen AI is a huge sort of aid. And so for us, we see a demand side shift in terms of how do you manage hybrid teams or manage teams where you might be distributed as well, right? Like they might all be going to offices, but you might be managing people who are in 5 different locations. You don't actually spend that much time with them. And at the same time, use the very best of technology to solve age-old problems that haven't been solved yet. And sort of feedback is a huge part of that. Goals is another big part of that, and how do you break down goals and help people stay on track. And so for us, we feel very lucky that we live in a very, very rapidly evolving world, and that provides a ton of opportunity to rethink things from first principles, and sort of not get bogged down by the way things have been done, but actually the way things should be done, taking all of the various ingredients into place.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I love that word ingredients as well too, because at the end of the day, you end up having a really great dish and you create really phenomenal things. But I think we have to understand that the way we prepared it yesterday, years ago,
Yeah.
shouldn't necessarily be the way that we prepare it today. And I think that one of the things, I was listening to an interview with you, and one of the things you talked about is like how, like in a sports game, a football game, or anything like that, you wouldn't say, okay, it's the end of the year. Let's look at the feedback that we have. You're finding that out on a regular basis. And why wouldn't a high performing team do that exact
Yeah.
same thing? And I love how you've coupled all those things with those seismic shifts as you talked about, and been able to kind of create something that's phenomenal.
No, and I think sports and fitness are a constant inspiration for us. And actually, if you look at a lot of high performance podcasts or things that people learn from, they learn from the army and they learn from sports, right? So like and finding mastery and other podcasts that talk about high performance rarely talk about the workplace. And that's because for whatever reason, our high performance approaches in the workplace are so woefully behind
Mhm.
versus other spheres of life. And which is why people being sports coaches into the office to like inspire people and talk to them. But because those things are very, very one off. And so people walk into a room, you'll have an army general come in and it will feel all great. But when you leave that room, you go back and do the same old shit that you were doing before. And so
Right.
so like nothing actually fundamentally changes unless you change the day-to-day approach. And with our collaborative team development model, we're trying to build a pretty holistic end-to-end approach on what a manager needs to do day in day out to get high performance out of the team, and then use technology to enable that on a consistent basis.
Nice. And I feel like that consistency is such a big part, especially when being able to kind of leverage that technology, so that it's not just, one day it's this, the next year it's that, and being able to kind of have that, we want to have certain goals. And a lot of times to have those goals, you need to have that consistency in the activities, consistency in the measurement of the activities. And I imagine that's what you all are bringing to the forefront. So I wanted to drill down a little bit more, hear a little bit more on what that looks like, how you're serving the clients, how it works. Could you take us through what that experience is?
Yeah, so a lot of our work ends up being grounded in a 5 layer hierarchical model we developed. And we call that collaborative team development, or CTD in short. And essentially, it has 5 hierarchical layers to it, and I think the crux of it is really in the hierarchy. So the 5 layers are energy, goals, celebrate feedback, improvement feedback, and ongoing skills and development. And really distilling it down for managers to realize that if you have 4, 6, 8 direct reports, each of those direct reports have a very different set of present needs based on how they're performing along that hierarchy. So, for example, if someone's going through a mental health challenge or something at home, or they're new to an organization and feel incredibly overwhelmed, then managing things at the energy layer and unpacking what's going on there is the most important piece. And actually, for someone who's not even crawling yet, giving them improvement feedback on what they can do better is actually going to further demotivate them than actually help them out. And you need to operate at a much more basal or foundational level to get them to a better place. The next layer above that is goals. And actually, goals constitute a very, very large chunk of performance. And we sort of attribute about 40% of as we think about the whole framework to goals. And what we see in most organizations is that while they are good at setting out company goals, so they're able to articulate what the organization needs to get from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, and even break that down, maybe in some cases, to teams or departments, it very rarely trickles down to the individual. And
Mm.
so most individuals don't have a sense of clarity on what are the 5 or 8 things in terms of targets, projects, or skills that they're actively working on, and how to prioritize between them. And one of the core things we do with a customer is to ensure that every individual has a clear articulation of what are those 3 to 5 target or project goals they're working towards, or a skill goal that they need to get better at. And typically, managing energy and managing goals are, if you just do those 2 things right, you can get decent performance out of every person in the organization.
Nice.
And people often are like, oh, this person does this thing not that well, etc. But that is sort of lip service over, does this person actually understand where they move the needle, and have we
Mm.
actually articulated and distilled that down and broken that up the right way. And if you have those 2 layers right, then the next 3 layers drive in sustaining performance. So the layer right on top of that is this person receiving enough recognition in terms of what they're doing well to be able to clearly articulate what their superpowers or strengths are? And
Mm.
and actually, I was talking to a woman who runs IBM's talent transformation practice today, and there's a guy called Keith Ferrazzi, who I think was the first pioneers of strengths-based development. That
Mm.
actually, it's a lot more powerful to know what you're good at versus what you can get better at. And the more time you spend using your strengths, the more productivity an organization gets out of you. And actually, that re-energizes you because you're actually doing things that you excel in. And then the last 2 layers, which is constructive feedback to identify blind spots, and then learning new skills, and those can be behavioral skills or can be technical skills, then sort of ensures that people feel like they're learning and growing and getting better. Um, and all of those 5 components are key to drive high performance. But the needs of where each person needs help likely moves week on week and moves person to person. And most managers are not necessarily calibrating that on a regular basis. And so with our platform, we make sure that managers have a visibility and an understanding of what's happening across those 5 layers. And through our next actions engine, we then prompt managers to take action along those 5 layers based on where the most impact will take place.
Nice. I appreciate you so much in breaking that down. And I almost wonder those five foundational aspects and understanding how it's, for lack of a better term, sounds baked into the DNA of the organization, but also everything you all are doing is part of like what is like different and how you approach it. Because again, I mean, I love the foundational part, especially being that energy part, because I say so often we forget about the human part of business and
Yes.
understanding like if somebody just had, someone maybe they lost in their lives, or maybe
Yeah.
they're sick or not feeling good, how it ends up being building blocks and how that can affect all the other four aspects if those things aren't taken care of. But I love how it's built, almost like it sounds like and correct me if I'm wrong with the shape, like kind of like a pyramid where you start to see that success happen as you start to build upon the bricks and continue to go higher up and continue to excel and execute a lot better.
Now, a lot of people are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Whereby
Hmm.
if someone doesn't have basic shelter or basic food, then things like self-esteem or self-actualization are irrelevant. And it's very similar, right? So, and it's sort of our hierarchy of high performance needs in an organization. But and that's what, like, we've been able to take so much inspiration from other aspects of life or other spheres. And um, unfortunately, because corporate tools get sold for functionality versus experience, they've been massively underserved by tech. And so consumer tech ends up being much more experientially focused because in order to make money, people have to use the goddamn thing.
Right.
But in business, you just need to sell it. Whether people use it or not becomes secondary. And so people's energies get focused on selling it versus
Mhm.
building it for usage. And as a software company, we think about ourselves much more as a consumer company in terms of driving behavior. And a lot of people don't like that because they're like, oh, like, can you really change behavior? And I think social media apps have showed us, yes, you can change behavior. And there's a very clear science to habit and how that gets formed. We just haven't spent the time and effort to apply that to the workplace in the same way. And so nothing that we're doing is necessarily radically new as a concept. We've just stitched a few things together and applied it to the workplace, and then magic happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's definitely magical. And there's a book that I read years and years ago called The Opposable Mind. And it talked a lot around like the innovations happen because, and I think we're starting to see a world where this happens more and more and more, where things are not in silos. It's not saying, again, like I talked about, either or, it's actually saying both. And I think when you have that understanding of the human part of business and the human part of life at that, and able to pull from that because they're not separate, they're all aligned. Because if you have like a bad day at home, a lot of times it will affect you at work and vice versa.
Absolutely.
If
Absolutely.
you understand that and marry that with the technology and have that baked into that, it allows you to do that word, which really stuck out to me. It allows a manager to be able to calibrate and be able to understand like what adjustments can be made so that those goals happen without ignoring the fact that their energy isn't where could be able to execute at that high level. So it's not either or, it's both and
Yeah.
better at that.
No, absolutely. And that changes, right? Like, not everyone's a permanent high performer or a low performer, and it ebbs and flows on how things are going. And often also in organizations, like, I've heard people say, "Oh, this person's good and this person's bad," and it's very binary, and it lacks the nuance around.
Hmm.
But, like, are all the ingredients in place to get the best out of this person, and have we been somewhat disciplined around breaking that down versus thinking about it as a model? And everybody can be a high performer, low performer, depending on the context.
Yeah.
And that's why even in startups or in CEO land, like, the same CEO can woefully fail and then incredibly succeed based on what the context is, and based on what the timing is, and based on what resources they will gather. And so, I there's a quote I had read that the only way to get better as a CEO is to keep doing it. And if you ask
Hmm.
the best CEOs, the really best ones will tell you they got there by just not giving up.
Mm.
um, and sort of going through the motions that then kept calibrating. And unfortunately, in the larger corporations, we tend to bucket people as high performers and low performers. But the reality is context matters, and it definitely isn't set in stone as to whether someone's a high performer or low performer.
Yeah, and that ends up being so powerful because I think that's like one of the big misconceptions around success is that it doesn't happen overnight. And a lot of times it is that resilience, the person that keeps saying, okay, I'm going to figure out a way, not necessarily that they find it out on the first time they try anything, which I don't think happens nearly as much as sometimes people thinks that it does. So absolutely appreciate that. So I wanted to switch gears a little bit
Yeah.
and I want to ask you for what I call a CEO hack. So this could be like an app, a book, or even a habit that you have, but what's something that makes you more effective and efficient?
Yeah, I mean, one of the, I think in many ways, if you ask me what what makes a good CEO, like so much about it is mindset, and being able to sort of reset where your head is, no matter what situation it is. And what I've found is listening to high quality content while being on the move just like resets my mind. And so if I feel like I'm stuck or I'm overwhelmed, like I'll take a walk around the block with a podcast. And it's either like Andrew Huberman or like Finding Mastery or like even Bloomberg Surveillance or like something that's intellectually engaging, and it immediately like gets me out of the funk I'm in, allows you to reset around it. And in many ways, like the brain's a muscle. And so if like it feels like it has a is that it has a kink in it, you just have to like get it back into like a different dynamic. And so for me, intellectually stimulating content while walking resets where my head's at.
Yeah, and as we know, I always butcher the quote: your thoughts become your actions become your words, your and so on and so forth to your destiny." But I think
Yeah.
so many times we don't realize that you can use that and approach that like a muscle. And I love like because Einstein's quote is, "You can see so much further by standing on the shoulders of giants." And the
Mhm.
way that we stand on giants is evolved so much. Like we can listen to podcasts, books, listen to TED talks, all these things to cultivate that high thinking that can get us out of those maybe paths or zones that we're in
Totally.
or ruts that we're in so that we can get to where we want to be. But we have to remember that we have to exercise it just like we would any muscle or sometimes do anything.
Yeah, and I actually think books are overrated and podcasts are
Mm.
underrated. And I think
Mm.
most books deserve to be a 1 hour podcast. And we just as humanity, because the written word travels much faster than the spoken word, because from a bandwidth perspective, even things like audio streaming is 10-20 years old. But
Mhm.
the power of listening to conversations in terms of how that exercises the mind and what it does to quieting it down is often even more powerful than a book. And which is why I think podcasts are such a powerful medium, that we don't fully understand the power of it. And just like the way there are crappy books, there are crappy podcasts, right? So like
Right.
and like there is a spectrum of quality to a lot of things. But I am incredibly grateful for the medium because not only does it sort of help me from a mental health perspective to do certain things, but the pace of learning from content is huge because it's a stream of consciousness that then allows me to then formulate my sort of outcome and conclusion, versus a book is written as a narrative, right? And that narrative is already created, but actually what I want to do is come to my own narrative, and a podcast then serves as an input to get there, which just works better as a cognitive learning process, um than a book does necessarily.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I feel like, and I don't know if you feel the same way, that it kind of taps into that human part. Because again, when you hear the voice, and especially if you have two people like we're having now, that conversation, you hear that back and forth. I feel like it taps into that as well, too. Whereas a book is
Yes.
a lot more of a older school, I would say, way
Yeah.
that we get information, where even we see that from like social media is one of the most innovative things, because it doesn't mean somebody just blasts a message and nobody else can say anything. But in the same way, I feel like podcasting, these other newer platforms, vlogging, things like that, taps into that human part, but also that back and forth kind of engagement that I think sometimes helps to I guess create that iron sharpening iron type of conversation and
Yeah.
opportunity.
No, absolutely. And then you think about yourself as another voice in that conversation, and that does very interesting things to the brain. Like having conversations is like the oldest medium that existed, but somehow today information is sort of spread more in writing, and that's because there was a
Mhm.
technology limitation to having conversation spread. So we relied on the written word. We don't need to do that anymore because that limiter no longer exists, but behaviorally we haven't caught up to it yet.
Yeah, and it makes so much sense. And I even when I like have things on Kindle and things like that, I always look for the Audible version, because I do like that. You can increase the speed, you can have that, human touch and things like that. And even if I'm not staring at the book or the screen, you still can hear those things, and they really kind of I think get cemented even more from there.
No, absolutely.
Perfect, perfect, perfect. So you might have already touched on this, but I want to ask you for what I call a CEO nugget. A little bit more word of wisdom or piece of advice. I like to say it might be something you would tell your favorite client, or if you hopped into a time machine, you might tell your younger business self.
Yeah, I think people forget that a lot of leadership or management or entrepreneurship goes back to like a deep self-awareness and a deep understanding of sort of who you are and what makes you tick. And I think that most journeys that are meaningful are full of struggle. Um, and ultimately, a struggle that you believe is worthwhile is a good struggle. Um, and when you are in a good struggle, you persevere, and it gives you grit, it gives you resilience. So much of what people talk about in entrepreneurship, but it's almost the output, but the input really is sort of really doing something that comes from a place of high conviction, and comes from a deeper place. I think things done for the pursuit of money um wear out, and sort of makes it harder to endure. But when you do it from a place that is deeper, it's easier to sustain.
Yeah, I would definitely, agree with that. And I think there was a book I read years ago called Drive, and I can't remember who wrote it, but a
Mm,
lot of it was around this idea that, so many times, especially around, leadership, just give a few dollars, give a pay increase, and that's going to motivate the person. But really understanding that, again, that self-awareness, and really sometimes doing that work to understand that, not only that doesn't kind of preclude us or stop any type of struggle. A lot of times it makes the struggle worthwhile. And I feel like it even gives it definition and kind of even value in doing that, because a lot of times that ends up being the gift, going through the process, the journey,
yeah.
whether it is at a job, a CEO, whatever it is, our position. But if
Yes.
we start to understand ourselves and then understand our journey, the path that we take, then we start to really get a lot more, I think, not only I think gifts, but I think appreciation for the steps that we take. And sometimes even if those steps are backwards and not the way we want them to go.
No, absolutely. And I think that's why critical thinking becomes so important as a human skill, and really questioning the why, and going 3 or 4 layers down than what might be immediately apparent to understand what's going on, both in yourself and people working with you, or your relationships, or whoever matters to you.
Yeah, absolutely. You could definitely hear that critical thinking and everything that you talked about, and how you started, on loop, and being able to kind of understand that there has to be a better way. And rather than just saying that, actually going through, rolling up your sleeves and executing on that.
Absolutely.
Perfect, perfect, perfect. And so now I want to ask you my absolute favorite question, which is the definition of what it means to be a CEO. And our goal is to have different quote unquote CEOs on the show. So Projjal, JJ, what does
Mhm.
being a CEO mean to you?
I think it's a good question, and I think it's a word that is overused, frankly. And I think people use the word CEO, founder, entrepreneur, a little bit interchangeably. But if you think about CEO and break it down, it's chief executive officer, right? And I think the core word there is execute and execution, which is deliver on a plan, um, and that plan being set out by a CEO and its shareholders, usually represented by a board. And I think that a CEO ultimately needs to achieve results and achieve outcomes, and know how to organize and allocate resources to achieve that outcome. And that might be a revenue outcome, it can be a profitability outcome, it can be a movement or community outcome in terms of how many people you influenced or how many users you had. So you can define it in different ways, but ultimately it's about execution. And a lot of people talk about vision. And I think, again, vision is one of these things that are overrated, and execution is one of these things that are underrated. And and I think Einstein said this, or someone attributed to him, that vision without execution is hallucination. And I think it's incredibly true. And I don't think having a lofty vision is that hard. I think a lot of people can have lofty visions. Saying that you want to get to Mars is not hard. Um, but then figuring out what is the right sequence of steps to get there, hell a lot harder. And I think very, very good CEOs, and Lee Kuan Yew, who founded Singapore and made Singapore where it is, was probably one of the best CEOs ever, but not in a company context, because he had a very clear vision of where he wanted to get Singapore to from where it was, but then was able to really execute and really sort of focus on all of the pieces that needed to be true together. And I think today we lack that combination in people, and people who are able to have clarity of vision, but then quality of execution to follow up on that vision.
Yeah, I love that perspective, and I think so many times, like I often will talk about like entrepreneurship and business in terms of like being the ability to be able to solve problems. But in order to solve the problem, you have to execute from where the problem is to get to the solution. And as you said so well, it becomes so easy to be able to say, we're going to go to Mars. It becomes less easy to be able to execute on how you're going to be able to get to Mars. And I think when you start to really understand the execution is, I think, what kind of separates those people that are able to talk the talk versus those that are able to walk the walk and execute the talk, the walk, and all those things. And I think those are few and far between. So I love that definition, because I think it honestly, to me, gets to the essence of what business and entrepreneurship is. And I think what kind of can separate those people that are really great at the things that they do.
And I think there's often also a knowledge and action gap, right? So, for example, if someone told me to give a talk on how to climb Mount Everest, I probably could pretty convincingly, and like convince people I know all the steps. It's not the same as doing it. And I think that is also part of the problem today, where knowledge is democratized, right? And so a lot of people are peddling themselves as experts, and sort of calling themselves a lot of different things, but it is very different to having had done it, and really knowing what it is. And so, often I talk about the fact that I'm very glad I did not become a venture capitalist before I became a founder. Because the job of venture capitalists is really to identify and then advise founders. And often you might think you know what it's like. And frankly, if I had gone from being at Uber for a long time and like being at a scaling tech company, like, it's very easy to believe, yes, you then know what scale looks like. But the reality is, if you haven't started from scratch yourself and scaled it, you don't know. Um, and I think, the reason why Silicon Valley is a powerful tech hub is because a lot of the people who are making decisions around investing in startups and how startups should operate have really built things and build them from scratch and build them for a long time and have made a ton of mistakes. And then the kind of advice you give is very different. Um, and I think ecosystems around the world just haven't had the maturity to get there quite the same way. And so I think knowing how to do it is very different from doing it. And it's very easy to say, if you want to grow your business, just figure out the right channel and like think about outbound versus inbound and experiment with a few different messagings. Sounds like super straightforward, right? Like and so everybody can figure it out, but very different when you go about doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where a lot of times when you talk to somebody that has actually done it, you start to realize that it's not easy, it's not simple, it's not straightforward. Or I guess it could be simple in the sense that you know what to do, but it's not easy because the execution part starts to come in, and you start to realize that it's not as easy to execute as sometimes it sounds like when you hear the gurus or the people that maybe haven't rolled up their sleeves nearly as much.
And the more you do it, the more you realize that you know nothing. And
Yes.
and the only thing you can do is get really good at attracting good people to your movement.
Mhm.
And frankly, that is the only skill that sustains through, because if you find the right people and set them up for success the right way, execution magic happens. If you try and do it yourself, for and you have to know just about enough to also know who to look for. And so
Yeah.
you can't because you can't go by someone's credentials, because you'll never have seen it. So you have to also know if the person really gets it, or not. But in my experience, magic happens from an execution perspective when you hire the right people and you set them up the right way.
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to that, standing on the shoulders of giants, a lot of times just by being able to kind of realize who those giants are, and so many times we can miscalculate and end up being on the floor with the so-called giant. But it's good to be able to get those people that are able to actually execute. So, JJ, truly appreciate that definition. Of course, I appreciate your time even more. So, what I want to do now is pass you the mic, so to speak, just to see if there's anything additional that you can let our readers and listeners know, and of course, how best people can get a hold of you, find about all the awesome things you and your team are working on.
Yeah, no, I think at the end of the day, if people are listening to this podcast, either they are CEOs or they want to understand how to be a CEO. But I think ultimately everybody is a CEO, and it's the CEO of their own lives. Even if you do nothing else, you do control where you spend your time and how you allocate that resource of yourself. And I think what I would tell people to do is to push their assumptions around certain things, and a lot of that is often around money and how much money you need to live happily. And frankly, what I've realized is the more I live a life of purpose and mission, I actually need less money, and I spend less money this last year versus the year before. And that's because if you enjoy what you do, you don't really spend a lot of money on too many things. And I wear company branded clothes, and as long as I get decently fed, and you know, I, I don't drink $20 of wine anymore. They're $50 bottles of wine, but they're not that expensive. But
Mhm.
I think really believing that your life is worth something, and that resource is valuable, and figuring out how you allocate it to execute on a good life is the right place to start up as a CEO. Whether you then go and extend that to a company or a mission or something else is secondary, but be your own CEO. And that's the right place to start.
Nice. I absolutely love that. And people that want to follow up and find out more, what's the best way?
Yeah, I think LinkedIn's the best way. JJ Ghatak or Projjal Ghatak will find me on LinkedIn, and please feel free to add me or follow me or send me a message. I do read everything that comes in. I don't always respond, but I do read everything, and I love hearing from folks.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. And of course, to make that even easier, we'll have the links and information in the show notes as well, too, for all the awesome things that JJ and the team are working on as well. But truly appreciate your time. Obviously, I appreciate even more. Like, I think so many times when we look for answers, we're always looking externally. That self-awareness piece is so huge, whether we're talking about being a CEO of a company or, like you mentioned so well, a CEO of our lives. Once we start to have that self-awareness, we start to understand and I think really see the superpower, the value, the things that we have and what we can bring to organizations, to families, to communities, whatever it is. But I think it starts with that. And I love how you've been able to couple that, not either or, but with technology, with these innovations so that we can, at the end of the day, reach our goals and crush them at the end of the day. So thank you so much again, JJ. Appreciate your time. And I hope you have a phenomenal rest of the day.
No, thank you for having me, and thank you for the kind words. It's been a pleasure.